What was the genetics of the ancient Celts, and how has this influenced modern Celtic peoples? Also, how common has red hair been amongst the Celts down through history, and how strong is the link today between Celtic peoples and red hair? Now, during the Iron Age, Celts were found across Europe, stretching from Britain, Ireland and the Iberian Peninsula all the way to Galatia and modern Turkey. Gaul was the home of Celtic civilization, however, an area in Western Europe centred on modern France, but it included parts of other modern countries such as Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Germany and northern Italy. Today, the influence of Celtic-speaking peoples is limited to Britain, Ireland and France, with 6 Celtic languages still spoken today: Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Manx on the Isle of Man, Welsh, Cornish and Breton spoken in Brittany. But what do we know about the genetics of both ancient and modern Celts, as well as physical traits like red hair? Well, let's start by looking at some of the historical descriptions of the Celts to see what they looked like historically and whether red hair was a common feature amongst them. One really interesting description comes from the Roman historian Tacitus, who lived between 56 and 120 AD. He wrote in the late 1st century AD about the physical characteristics of the ancient Britons, in particular writing about 2 ancient Celtic people: the Caledonians to the north, a fierce tribal confederation of ancient Scotland, and the Silures to the west, a powerful tribe of ancient Wales. Tacitus wrote that the physical features of the people present many varieties, from which inferences can be drawn. The red hair and large limbs of the inhabitants of Caledonia proclaim their Germanic origin. The swarthy faces of the Silurians, the generally curly quality of their hair, and the position of Spain opposite their shores attest to the passage of Iberians in old days and the occupation by these districts. Now, it's interesting that Tacitus thought that the Caledonians could have been of Germanic origin, looked of Germanic origin. I remember when me and my sister were flying to New York about a decade ago, the flight attendant thought we were German, even though we're obviously Scottish. To the Romans and Greeks, however, they probably would have looked quite alike. Both tall peoples, according to their descriptions, with both red and blonde hair relatively common amongst them. Although the Celts are associated with red hair, some ancient descriptions say that they had blonde hair as well, which is more associated with Germanic peoples, as I noted in a previous video. The ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus described the ancient Celts as having blonde hair, for example, which they apparently tried to enhance using lime water. As he wrote, "The Gauls are tall of body, with ripping muscles and white of skin, and their hair is blonde. And not only naturally so, for they also make it their practice by artificial means to increase the distinguishing colour which nature has given it. For they are always washing their hair in lime water, and they pull it back from the forehead to the nape of the neck." So although there is some variation in hair colour amongst the ancient Celts, and it can actually be quite difficult to separate red hair and blonde hair at different times, strawberry blonde for example, which is my hair colour, and basically red hair does have deep historical roots amongst Celtic peoples in general. If you look at these maps, you can see that today there is a pretty strong correlation between the peoples who speak Celtic languages and the prevalence of red hair, with the levels of red hair highest in Ireland at between 10 and 30%, and in Scotland at between 10 and 25%, followed by Wales, Cornwall and Western England, then Brittany, the Franco-Belgian border, then Western Switzerland, Jutland and southwest Norway. This presence of relatively high levels of red hair in areas of Norway and Scandinavia in general is at least partly associated with the Vikings taking slaves back from Scotland and Ireland during the Viking Age. As I note in my video on Norwegian DNA, we know that Norway saw an increase in British-Irish ancestry during the Viking Age, driven both by the forced migration of slaves as well as the voluntary immigration of Christian missionaries. This inflow of British-Irish ancestry during the Viking Age is thought to have increased the levels of red hair in Norway. So there is a pretty strong connection between Celtic peoples and red hair, but this is not exclusive, with parts of Russia also having high levels of people with red hair, for example, namely the Udmurt Republic, but I will look at that in a separate video. What's your hair colour out of interest? Please let me know below. But what about the genetics of the Celts? Well, the most common Y-DNA haplogroup amongst the ancient Celts were branches of R1b P312, with the most notable Celtic branches being RDF27, RL21 and RU152. More specifically, if we look at Gaul itself, R1b-U152 seems to have been the most common Y-DNA haplogroup amongst these ancient Celts, yet the other branches were found as well. What is interesting though, is that if we look at the maps of these different Celtic branches today, they are associated with different parts of Europe. For instance, R1b-L21 is associated more with Atlantic Celts, and we can see this if we look at the map of this haplogroup today, with it very high in places like Ireland, Scotland, Wales and Brittany. If we look at the map of R1b-DF27 on the other hand, this is much more associated with Iberian Celts, and it is still very high in the Iberian Peninsula today, as this map shows. And finally, if we look at this map of R1b-U152, we can see it's found much more centrally, in places like France, southwest Germany, Switzerland and down into northern Italy. So these branches of R1b are key markers of Celtic DNA on the Y-DNA side. But how did R1b spread to Europe in the first place? Well, it is thought to be associated with migrations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe during the Bronze Age, associated with the Yamnaya culture and other related peoples. We know as well that the Celtic lineages are a branch of the Indo-European lineage family. To be clear though, the ancient Celts did not belong exclusively to R1b, as they would have carried various other lineages present in Central Europe prior to the Iron Age, including G2A, L497, EV13, and probably also I2A2B, L38. Now if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing. But what can we say about Celtic DNA today? Well, before we look at that, I would like to quickly thank my Patreon members for voting in an exclusive poll for this video topic. If you would like to vote for what video topics I make videos on, I will put a link below to my Patreon page. And also, if you like this jumper, I will put a link below to my merch store where you can support some more independent content. Thanks for your support, but back to Celtic DNA today. Well, although the legacy of the ancient Celts is seen broadly across Europe, if we use a common way to define a Celt as someone who speaks a Celtic lineage, or at least from a country who speak a Celtic lineage, we can say that the most common Celtic Y-DNA haplogroup today is R1b-L21, which is the main haplogroup of the Atlantic Celts. If we put this haplogroup next to the map of red hair and the speakers of Celtic lineages, you can see a pretty strong correlation between all three. R1b-L21 is thought to have reached Britain and Ireland between around 2100 and 2000 BC, and it was brought into these islands due to a migration from continental Europe. This migration was probably connected to the spread of the Bell-Beaker culture, which is thought to have been a major vector for the spread of steppe ancestry into Britain and Ireland. We also have early examples of this haplogroup in these islands. A 2015 study published in PNAS, for example, analysed the DNA of 3 Bronze Age males from Rathlin Island, which is just north of mainland Ireland, who lived between around 2000 and 1500 BC. All 3 men have significant steppe ancestry, and they belong to RL21 on the Y-DNA side, which confusingly is also known by a longer name, R1b, 1A2A, 1A2C. In addition, a companion found close to the Amesbury Archer, who was an early Bronze Age Bell-Beaker man found near Stonehenge, also belonged to RL21. So this haplogroup has deep roots in places like Britain and Ireland, stretching back thousands of years. What about Celtic DNA on the maternal side though? Well, there isn't as much variety on the mitochondrial side, with H being the most common mitochondrial haplogroup, both in ancient times and today, amongst Celtic peoples, notably H1 and H3. Variations of H are found across Europe in general though. H is believed to have originated in the Near East around 25,000 years ago, and its movement into Europe seems to have been through various waves, including an early wave into southern Europe, with a major increase when the first farmers from the Near East swept across the continent, with them reaching Britain and Ireland around 6,000 years ago. Some of the other ancient mitochondrial haplogroups of Europe are also found amongst the early Celts, such as U5 for example. Do you know your DNA haplogroups out of interest? Please let me know in the comments below and your thoughts in general. So the Celts played a significant role across many parts of Europe, and their genetic legacy is still found today, even though large parts of Celtic Europe was conquered by the Romans, notably with Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul beginning in 58 BC. One part of the world associated with Celtic culture and red hair is Ireland, of course. You've got to love the Irish. But what is the genetic history of Ireland? To find out, please click here. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell and let me know your thoughts below, and I'll see you next time.